For the past few years, Marvel has been suffering a huge slump since the end of Endgame, most notably seen in Phase 4 and now actually carried over into Phase 5. With the exception of films like No Way Home, Somewhat in Wakanda Forever, and Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, most of the content they have been releasing has not been hitting well. A problem I've had where most recently I couldn't bear to continue watching Secret Invasion at all, finding it boring and not interesting like it used to be because of everything around it. I mean, there are various interesting concepts that are okay, but the discourse surrounding it and everything with Marvel just makes me not want to watch it anymore until later. This explosion of Marvel content has really diluted any reason to watch it, suffering from a similar problem to Star Wars at this point with the end of the saga in Rise of Skywalker, which was actually released the same year as Avengers Endgame. Both films are actually, in my opinion, not very good looking back on it. It all feels generic and boring, and the Disney Plus series has done nothing to actually help them at all, and quite frankly actually made it worse despite my initial opinions thinking it would have been a good idea to continue the universe without theatrical releases. But the problem that is now being presented has shown that this hasn't quite worked to great success, where the same comedic boring ass tropes are actually still present in each film that we expect of a Marvel film. It's where films like Eternals are being suited better as a series and how some series were better suited as being a singular film. How I just don't find much interest actually watching it because it's the same filler crap. And when you consider those issues lumped in together at the end of a film that satisfied a collection of films, you don't really find the need or interest to watch Marvel anymore. I mean, it's not dying, far from it, other than the clickbaity channels who say so, where you can still have great quality films like Guardians being released, where the MCU just lacks a reason to being watched anymore. And this is something everyone has already said at this point, but just more apparent by the rejection of series like Secret Invasion online by many other issues. Because as we all know, watching the MCU used to be an event that we had to witness. Every movie connected well with each other and had a reason to lead up to the events of every film like Infinity War and Endgame to pay off well. But even now with the standout good films, it really just feels jumbled and confused, hard to keep up with what is going on, and nobody actually knows what to think about anymore, forcing them to skip out on films like I have done. I mean, it's not bad, but these films still manage to be the top highest grossing films of the year, but it's just how they set a new standard to be expected from films to make $1 billion at the box office, to have a reason for people to go out in theaters every single time, which is actually a good thing. Watching films on the big screen is actually a plus and an event that we all like, but it now feels all saturated and a chore to what the MCU actually is. And that is the reason why I had to title this to Why Marvel Needs to Change, because it really does, and it's something many people and other YouTubers has presented as time has gone on, but the problem just keeps coming worse, because there are so many mismatched ideas that started in the previous phase that is affecting the current one, even despite the good films that have been released, that now they have delayed multiple films to be pushed back from the release dates, like the long-awaited Avengers films with Kang because of what has happened recently. You can just really feel what you felt after Endgame, thinking that this is the highest that they could go and how you would not find newer Marvel remotely interesting as much as what has already happened. It feels too much to add to a world that concluded so well with a great villain and a great set of heroes, and that certainly has been the case. But it also actually didn't have to be with what they did before, because once again we have seen moments and glimpses of actual quality in this new era of Marvel, but they just squandered that with everything else. They have become what the overall criticism of the MCU was originally, the same formulaic comedic superhero films that have nothing to offer anymore. The only thing they actually have left at this point is just the goodwill from the previous era and good films, but it still doesn't excuse any decision that was being made by Disney or Marvel for the past few years. The company is now treating this and Star Wars as moneymakers and nothing else like their live action films, without any care or proper regard for the development of its world or characters. And that is actually affecting the quality of the films, because people are just not excusing this laziness anymore, and we will see that when the Marvels actually comes out, judging by the tone of the film and the reception of previous movies like Ant-Man. Because the thing about Guardians that made it work was the fact it still retained stuff like the James Gunn style that we were used to in the previous two films, that was actually vastly different from the rest of the MCU style, for a set of unknown characters in the comic book genre that really uses comedy in a well-balanced manner to have an emotional conclusion and story connected with it. It works because that is how it was designed to be, where the other movies, despite their directors, instead just feel designed by committee rather than the work of the person most people came to know or the sake of a good story. You felt this in films like The Multiverse of Madness, directed by Sam Raimi, who I like, regarding the Spider-Man trilogy and the Evil Dead films, and felt some of his style here, where after No Way Home, I was widely anticipating this very movie to provide such thrilling storytelling and to have a lot of horror elements to it. And while the film does have some of his signature stuff here and there, it still really feels like it wasn't his overall overall vision. We know that the original director from the first Doctor Strange left due to creative differences, where this film overall feels like it has a lot of creative differences. I mean, the choice to make Wanda as the villain was certainly unique and something I was looking forward to with Raimi's style and vision, but it still felt weird when you put stuff like WandaVision into context, which of course is important to add considering the topic of this video. It felt like nothing was being learned trying to make it her story and virtually not Doctor Strange, strangely enough, where he and other characters like America Chavez in this film really don't go anywhere. I mean, they do mention the consequences of his actions and focus on him, but the main focus is really on Wanda and nowhere else. Everything he does is important because he caused the destruction in many other universes, but it's still inconsequential to his very story, where other characters like America Chavez has really nothing to do, nothing other than being a MacGuffin to the film's story being a Strange versus Wanda one, a story that moves too quickly and too fast to actually matter and try to dive into the multiverse without proper meaning to it. The reason why I have to start with this movie is because it is the first proper MCU multiverse movie, which sort of started in Endgame and continued on in series like Loki presenting Kang as the threat. It's something of debate where people question its use in storytelling, but actually has worked with films like Everything Everywhere All at Once and recently Across the Spider-Verse, how Into the Spider-Verse actually kicked off this trend to great success, and how movies like this actually take that to new heights, and how you can work the multiverse into your story. You feel the importance of the multiverse playing into the Spider-Man story and the characters rather than the multiple attempts to explain without little development at all. It just works because of how it relates to that point, and this movie really didn't do that, where the cameos couldn't connect because they're based upon characters that hardly have any connection to the originals and just felt done for the sake of it like most. Because this brings us to the previous years where they released films like Shang-Chi, which was good to build off, but then before that you also had films that shouldn't have been released like Black Widow, feeling so inconsequential coming out after the film she supposedly died in, and how other projects were going haywire all over the place in the timeline thanks to Endgame. This movie takes place way back in 2016, and now we have movies taking place in 2026. It's idealist to follow because it has no coherency, unlike the previous three phases that followed the year of its release, except for a few. It was good because it felt like you were experiencing the journey in real time, and now with the series and other movies you really don't understand how this is actually playing into the MCU at all. Like I mentioned earlier, Loki is serving as the template of the MCU's new goals after the Infinity Saga in the Multiverse Saga to set up Kang and whatnot, where I really like the entire build-up of him as a threat being talked about, but everything else in the MCU up until Ant-Man hasn't really connected well with that very point. You had okay starts with shows like WandaVision and Falcon, but most of their endings just felt like they crashed and burned for me, feeling so uninspired. I felt like shows including Miss Marvel and Hawkeye and Moon Knight really would have benefited from being a full-length movie about the specific characters, because they just had so much stretched so thin that could have been easily resolved by moving all of that filler content, but they never really did that and never really connected to the phase's overall goals. How I just don't find a need to watch them because it really doesn't matter to anything the world has to offer. I mean, it's fine to have them be their own separate things to take place in their own worlds, but it can still have something like the Infinity Saga to have that consistency with the plan of the entire overall goal. You still had a reason to see something even if the film wasn't great, where despite their misses, it was still undeniably fun entertainment that had a little piece that actually made you watch the next film that was being released. And this brings us to the same time frame as The Eternals, the film that was released after Shang-Chi, which really felt directionless in its style and its themes. I mention this here again because it really felt more like it would have better fit as a series rather than a movie. You have these ancient Eternals created by the Celestials who helped shape human history, but then you have to constantly go back and forth to explain them, and it's just so underdeveloped in its ideas, and of course the point where you start to see how bad Marvel CGI was starting to get. How you see these films are being constantly released back to back, which affects the quality overall, where the action scenes you see in the films like this are just so awful to watch because of that point and because of the time constraints that they are dealing to get to the next point without any rhyme or reason for its story. And the ending with the dead Celestial actually has no weight to it whatsoever in films that were released after this or even the series. Nothing was actually mentioned because once again you have to mention in the Avengers Endgame putting into context screwing up the entire timeline, because in 2021 you had series being released like Falcon taking place in 2023, but then again at the end of the year you had series like Hawkeye that actually take place in 2024, and recently with Guardians it takes place on 2026 on that very timeline. You just have no idea what is actually going on, like what I actually said when the films actually took place in the original year of the release, now being all over the place because of that point that makes it worse to connect with because of the element of the Celestial being the ocean and nobody's actually talking about in these subsequent productions that are being released after, and it's really not clear to the audience. I mean, it's said that this kind of fact will play a major part in talking about it in the future, but it's really just not there at all at this point. Nothing is really warranted because of the multiverse timeline that is supposed to happen, which is not happening. This is coupled with, of course, the increase of comedy in each new film. It's not overly blatant, but it's still there to an increased degree with films like Thor: Love and Thunder being released. The film wasn't outright bad, but actually wasn't good either, being overdone in this comedic way where Ragnarok actually balanced them out. And I really didn't like this because it actually ruined Thor's character being tipped on being too funny on the scale without any rhyme or reason to why it should have been that way. I like Taika Waititi and his projects, but this seemed way too overboard for the story, where I feel confused if it was his overall intentions or what the studio wanted to actually do the same they did with Raimi. It just felt dumbing down Thor's character and wasting others like Gore and even Jane's mighty Thor. It's a style that just feels so off with the tone of the characters and the journeys we've already taken place with, where it never really explained much about that post-blip actions after Endgame, that includes stuff like his trauma and whatnot and the world moving on. Once again, like the other films, the consequences they had previously don't matter or factor anymore because that's not the intention nor the focus of what is happening. The moments that need to happen for the characters are too far and too few between in the movie, where you get nothing as a result from this. And that is a fact to what has happened to shows like She-Hulk. And She-Hulk is a show that went about its comedy in the most obnoxious way possible with a pathetic excuse for a main character. Nothing about her is making her connectable in the slightest, especially by the action she did in the opening to the character most audiences would know going about into this very show. Instead of the overall growth you expect on the hero's journey, it gets knocked down by this blatant unknowledgeable writing about court dramas or just being overblown with this comedy that makes no sense, where that has literally happened to every other single MCU project. And because of all of these ingredients, the ending really has nothing to offer because it actually led you to one area before subverting everything else because the main character happens to break the fourth wall, something that will actually age badly in the course of time for a singular joke, really making nothing about the climax mattering because it's all erased. I really wanted to actually go in with an open mind and like the series and what she offered in the growth of any of the consequences Bruce tried to instill to her in the journey of being a hero, which she ignored, which was something that was sort of being leaned to in the series, but was just all knocked down by all the attempts of the writing that the series clearly suffered towards. The cameos are stupid and the characters that come back are utterly pointless or a shell of who they once were regarding the passage of time and fitting within the context of the comics and movies that have already came, like characters like Abomination. It is simply just one of the most awful things to come out of the MCU, and there is no doubt about it despite what others think. In fact, it was a new beginning trend of unlikable heroes that Marvel started to produce. This leads us to the most recent movie besides The Great Guardians in Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania. This film was really disappointing despite what others thought that could have offered a more interesting tonally serious experience that offered more explanation about Kang. But what we got instead was an utter shit show of crap, the accurate description of what the quantum realm actually provides. I mean, it's fine that the movie was going to have more CGI in the realm of the multiverse that's not real, but then again other characters like MODOK just look disgusting and his arc in the film is quite disgusting as well. The comedy of the film once again ruined everything about the story and the characters that made Kang very muted as a threat despite the intention I saw that they were going for to tie back into Loki and whatnot. This is where, similarly to She-Hulk, you had an unlikable hero in Cassie Lang. There is not a single glimpse or explanation to why she acts this way to her father or others because it wasn't told to us very well. Recasting her from Endgame was also a stupid mistake because you actually felt a connection in that film between Scott and Cassie from the years she thought she was dead, where this one feels like they have no relationship whatsoever and entirely ignored because that scene or anything else. This isn't Ant-Man's daughter in any way, and the only positive thing she does ties back into Darren Cross being told to be not a dick.
Tell me what to be.
I don't know, just don't be a dick.
I mean, what the fuck is this writing? Why do they even think that making her this way is going to actually sell the movie quite well when it eventually lost the studio money? They add no charm to the characters like they did before, and it clearly shows they're just scrapping for time to get to the point. It's another inconsequential adventure despite Scott's reservations at the end of the film. In this sense, they quite literally get out scot-free of the quantum realm without any real consequences to the story that they trekked along. The whole movie is trying to drum up Kang as a real threat in the entire phase, but it's not as impactful as we would like to think considering other things like phase 4 and the actions of the characters in this film. I mean, he really does show his glimpses of his power and threat, but it just feels so easy to deal with him, like it never actually mattered despite everyone mentioning how menacing he was. It's just the same as the last movie and how nothing actually matters anymore because they just decided to make you hate everyone and the actions instead. Like, why couldn't we just get something that actually has consequences to the story, like he actually does escape or Scott and Hope just get trapped? Why can't we have something that actually matters to the story? Why is phase 5 starting off with another movie that feels like the filler phase known as phase 4? So many films and series with little time that add remotely nothing interesting to say. It's not that they're absolute trash, but it's just they have nothing actually to say about the world like the MCU did before. Because this is where I like to mention how I liked films like Black Panther: Wakanda Forever and trying to deal with grief. How it's more serious than other MCU films try to be and trying to move on under the shadow of Chadwick's passing. I felt that in the film itself and its characters, where this one actually did more for its supporting cast of the first because of that, and more so than other MCU films that came out during the time. Where of course the CGI in the film was actually much better than the first and either of the films that just came out before or after this film. It just had so many elements that I actually wanted to improve upon the original but also can't because of what actually happened. And while not remotely being the greatest, where I don't think either Black Panther actually stands out for me to be quite as good as anyone else would think, it still did something remotely interesting and more grounded to what the MCU was more like. It had an interesting villain, which was not my favorite, but still suffices for the world they tried to build and the overall story, which was actually a great emotional one. One that just tried despite the circumstances and some moments that are just clearly messy, which also isn't saying much about the other films, but still proves somewhat that the films had something to offer for people to actually keep watching. And it's the same thing we actually said again with the Guardians of the Galaxy 3, an emotional film that balanced everything right with its story because it's the way that they were shaped up to be with in the beginning. It's an excellent conclusion to their story that paid off well, and glad it was made and what it wanted to do. It really felt like a movie I would willfully go out to see in the high peak of the MCU, but also dragged down by the other rush productions actually surrounding it. I felt invested in the team, especially Rocket's own backstory and the friends he had that were all caused by this villain who is really just a maniac out for perfection. Not a Thanos with a tragic background to save the universe, but one who just does because he can and wants to play God for the sake of it, not caring about the feelings of others no matter what he does that is cruel and wrong. It's a movie that is completely James Gunn's vision and wouldn't have succeeded if it weren't for that, unlike the other films mentioned before that I have said at the start being more designed by committee to sell toys to get to the end point, which of course as we all know hasn't worked because they had to delay every other film. You just have to realize that you have to give time to work out the world and actually give people reasons to watch it, because like most people say, superhero fatigue actually only exists because most stories like what Marvel has done are just so painfully mediocre now, where you just need to actually provide a reason for people to actually watch to be a good experience rather than a negative one. Because if you do that, then you can justify why people actually need to see each production, which phase 4 was supremely bad at showing. I really don't know how anything is actually tying back into the overall multiverse themes once again. I don't know what I should expect from this movie because of what is being learned and what is coming after. Because I saw how hypocritical WandaVision and the Multiverse of Madness were as films and series to its own characters, showcasing how stupid it is to tie both series and films together. Where I just don't know how general audiences are actually going to actually react to the other characters of these shows like Wanda and Ms. Marvel to the Marvels being a sequel to Captain Marvel. It just makes no sense because not everyone actually wants to watch it. It's just that even now after Ant-Man, there's nothing of substance actually being provided. I will wait to see what Loki's new season is to provide, but beyond that show and everything else that has happened, I really don't know what is going on. I just want consistency for the sake of it. I mean, terrible films like Thor: The Dark World still had something crucial that leads up to the events of Infinity War in some way, where the same can be said with the Age of Ultron despite being the most lackluster Avengers film, where once again with Civil War it had something to say that plays into how Thanos actually wins in the end. Every single movie and action that focused on its separate characters still had something and reason to the overall events, but phase 4 and 5 have nothing of substance to say about that point despite the actual quality work. I mean, the difference now that phase 5 has going for it is the actual delays and setbacks to actually separate each project more slowly so more people can actually dig into it, but it still follows phase 4's misguided filler arc that adds nothing, especially the film that is supposed to tie everything important about the multiverse saga. And the only way you can change that is if you manage to wipe out everything clean from executive Disney. You have to start over from everything, including the CEO, if you want something fresh and creative and and interesting in the storytelling aspect. I mentioned this become apparent in Disney animation, in Star Wars, and everything else that involves the company. And it's something we want to do instead of having this slog and painful obligation to watch in each and every project where we have no reason to do so. Nothing here is being justified to watch it anymore, and it is quite frankly Disney's own fault. It's interesting to see the company that prides itself on creative storytelling now has entered the stage of laziness, banking off of stories that have been already told before, ruining things like Marvel that had a good thing going but now just doesn't because of that perceived success, trying to capture it in other ways in such a short amount of time. Every problem they create has a simple solution with the power they hold, but they constantly have chosen not to do so, where you really don't know why they choose to do it other than money. They have had such interesting concepts for Marvel, but they chose to take the easy route. I mean, even No Way Home still had the nostalgic factor going for its success, but at the very least it also had something to add to MCU Peter Parker in his journey as Spider-Man. But like I mentioned before, in Strange it really doesn't work well with his cameos and other factors because of the story itself. It isn't inherently bad for you to do so, but just make sure you focus on the crucial aspect of the story that matters to the main characters. And the path you have provided has not been easy, with films like Endgame actually making easy solutions into harder problems, where because of that, nothing introduced was actually consequential at all, and you really feel that. How the world moved on from that like the snap of a finger, we're thinking about it more and more, the harder it is to actually love what Endgame actually provided in storytelling and why it's actually a terrible film. It just ruined everything going forward we see now, and that is very apparent. But I guess what I wanted to say and take away from this video is that Marvel should try to take a step back from what they've been trying to doing and work together closely to make a cohesive, connected story again. They need to change that in order to do something that services all, instead of one that feels more like an anthology of mixed work with no connection to the world's events whatsoever. That they aren't inherently bad, but just how people have just caught on to the lazy route they have went through going forward. How Disney has done this through their own strategies and streaming content, and how they just need to realize that considering other studios like Pixar struggling in theaters because of what they're making audiences perceive, they need to go back to actually promoting good storytelling. But they're just too incompetent and too greedy to actually care to that anymore. And unless you actually wipe that slate clean away from the table, you will have nothing to offer anymore other than being popcorn movies with no substance and being super generic. And with that said, I'm all done, so goodbye.